Hello, hello. My name is Crystal Petrie, and you are watching the Crystal Petrie podcast. I have a returning contributor to the podcast, Lee Neves, who is a political strategist, a political commentator as well. Thank you so much for joining us again, Lee.
Thank you for having me on again, Crystal. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's hop right into it. I am, and we are following President Trump for his first 100 days, and you are here to break down a few of the headlines that we have been seeing for the past week. So the first one going to obviously talk about today is tax day as we are doing this podcast, April 15th. And President Trump and DOGE have both stated that they are going to make cuts to the IRS. How do you think these cuts under DOGE is going to impact the refund process for the American people?
Well, I got to start off saying if there's any part of the federal government, I think 100% of America is okay with DOGE making cuts at. It is the IRS. Let's be very clear.
Okay.
Nobody likes those people.
Right.
But as far as it impacting the refund process, the unfortunate part here is that from the get-go, all of DOGE's cuts have been just very haphazard, very much just, cut first, ask questions later. I mean, that's basically their MO. Cut first, ask questions later. And so, yeah, I think there's a great chance that these cuts are going to impact the refund process. I think these cuts are really going to impact people who need, refunds, who need other IRS services the most impacted, the most vulnerable, not those who can afford it, not those who, have their own CPAs and tax lawyers and whatnot to work through everything. It's really the mom and pop operations, the middle class family struggling to make ends meet that looks forward to that refund every year. I mean, that's their vacation. That is, what they use to send their kids to summer camps or, sports camps during the summer. And it's if the past few months has told us anything, is that it really is going to affect, that group of people. It's going to affect refunds. It's going to affect, various tax help that is out there. And once again, the middle class and more vulnerable Americans are the ones who are going to get the short end of the stick.
According to the numbers, Lee, the people that voted for President Trump are the exact people that you just described. Do you think they knew that this was coming when they voted for him? Do you think that they cared when they voted for him that this was a possibility?
It's shocking the amount of times throughout the course of history you have had people always vote against their own self-interests. Just because someone sounds good or makes them feel good or makes them quote unquote feel seen. And that's how Trump got elected. He went to a section of America. He talked to a section of people that did not feel seen. And, the Democratic Party has, as much fault in allowing that space to take place as Trump does for taking advantage of it. But I honestly, especially in politics, I mean, there's a reason TV commercials are 30 seconds. There's a reason that when I make a mail piece for a candidate that I'm consulting for, that, it's the 5-second test. I got to catch the attention of someone in the 5 seconds from when they get the mail to when they put it in the garbage. Unfortunately, American voters have the attention span of a gnat, basically. The vast majority of them do, unfortunately. And it's society today. I mean, they've got a million other things on their plate. This isn't the America of the 30s, 40s, 20s, even the 50s and 60s, where, public discourse was greater, where people took that right to vote and really delved into the issues and the candidates and what they really stood for and how it was really going to affect them. Here, people are worried about getting their kids to their after school activities, going to their second job, going to their side hustle. They've got a million other things on their plate, and we really have turned into a instant gratification, short attention span society. And you're seeing it play out right now. A lot of people saw Donald Trump, him out there saying he's going to lower prices from day one. The fact that he wasn't the alternative, he wasn't the past 4 years, and that the previous administration had done nothing to ally fears of people that have built during the previous 4 years. And they voted for him thinking, well, I'm just going to believe this guy, everything's going to be great. And then surprise, it's not. And you see it already with and they're all anecdotal stories, but the amount of federal employees, especially in states like Kentucky, Tennessee, the Deep South, the Midwest, who were let go from their federal positions. And I remember it was a federal worker in the state of Kentucky. They interviewed him and he's like, well, no, I can't be let go. I voted for Trump. I mean,
wow.
That's not how it works. That's not how it works, buddy. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people pulled that lever, not knowing this was going to be the result. They thought as soon as he took office, because he said so, everything was going to be sunshine and roses. And they were looking for someone to tell them that everything was going to be okay. Voters were looking for someone to validate their fears on the economy, which is what Donald Trump did. Let voters know they were right. That's human nature. You like it when someone tells you what you're thinking is right. It's called human nature. And then they were looking for someone who from day one was just going to make everything, rainbows and sunshine. And that's not happening. And you're seeing it, his approval ratings are dropping. Elon Musk's approval ratings are lower than mine are with several ex-girlfriends. So, really people are really starting to wake up to be like, hey, this is not what we voted for. And, we'll see what comes to pass in the midterm elections next year.
That's exactly what I was about to ask you, Lee. Do you think the Trump administration is going to feel that come midterm elections in about a year and a half now?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I mean, here's a guy who went from saying, I'm going to lower prices on day one to now, well, Americans are going to have to feel some temporary pain with increased prices due to tariffs. It's not what people voted for. It's not what they voted for. I think you have a lot of people in federal government right now, Elon Musk being one of them. I'll pick on him yet again, that honestly, he's the richest guy in the world. He doesn't worry about, polls or who votes for who. He's in power right now. And he knows even if he gets out of power, he's still going to have more money than God himself. And he really doesn't have to worry about anything. So I really do think you have, the off-year elections are bad enough already for the party in power. I think it's going to be double this time. I think you're going to look at Democrats with definitely, if I were a betting man today, taking the House back. And even though it's a bad map, maybe having a shot at taking the Senate back. And that's really going to put Donald Trump in a bind for the final 2 years of his presidency.
Because right now, President Trump has a trifecta. He has the House, he has the Senate, and he has the Supreme Court.
He really does. He has a supposedly friendly Supreme Court, 6-3 conservative majority. He has the Senate, he has the House. And that's why they're trying to pass through as much as they possibly can, get as much as they possibly can here in these next 2 years. But what the American public is really finding out is that a lot of what they voted for is not what the Republican agenda is. Cutting Medicare, cutting federal subsidies to important sectors like ag, like clean energy, sectors that employ Americans, and really cutting those jobs, going after higher education, which is supposed to be the bastion of free thought. That's not what people voted for. People voted to lower the price of eggs and have cheaper gas. That's what people voted for. They voted for that and to strengthen the border. And right now, that's at least the lower price of eggs and lower gas. It's not happening. It's going the other direction. Direction. And instead, what they see is a Trump administration and a president who unfortunately, look, I've been following this guy for quite a while. He loves to chase shiny balls. That's why you saw the Gulf of America. That's why you see this fascination with buying Greenland. Ooh, hey, here's this nice shiny ball. Let me go talk about it, instead of this is what I ran on. This is what I need to deliver on to ensure that my party stays the majority party in the midterm elections.
Do you think, Lee, that President Trump, Elon Musk, and everyone else in the Republican Party, they're creating the problem of firing all of these Americans from these federal jobs? And
Yes.
then on the other hand, they're saying we're going to raise tariffs because we want American jobs and American made.
They are. They're definitely creating a problem. On the one hand, look, Elon Musk comes in and is treating federal government like it's one of his companies he bought, like X, where he could just strip it down and build it in his own image. And you can't do that. You can't do that with any government, federal, state, local, you name it. That's not how government functions. And yeah, it's, on the cost of living, it's, Trump is very much going against his word for something that is a long-term play. Bringing manufacturing, bringing those jobs back to America is a long-term play. Not going to see the benefits of it in the 2026 midterm elections. Probably not going to see it in the 2028 presidential election. If you want to bring manufacturing jobs back to America, there's a better way to do it than tariffs. There is focusing on career and technical education in your K through 12 grades. Because even if you brought back every manufacturing job that went overseas, you got to have people with the ability and the technical skill set to do those jobs. And right now, that's not happening in a lot of places. There's strengthening the education component of career and technical education. There is streamlining the approval process. There is cutting the red tape. There are a variety of other ways that we can make those jobs come back to America without raising tariffs, because it's going to be a long-term play. And yes, these other things I'm talking about, they're going to take time, but bringing jobs back to America is going to take time. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in a year. It's a very much a long-term play, and we're dealing with an electorate that loves instant gratification.
Do you think, Lee, going back to the IRS and cuts, do you think that the IRS being cut is going to affect the wealthy at all? Perhaps with them trying to evade paying taxes or anything else. Do you think that it's going to affect them, or do they have safeguards?
They have safeguards. They're able to afford their CPAs and their tax attorneys and, you name it. They're able to put in their wealth gives them the ability to put in these safeguards to where whatever changes happens at the IRS due to cuts, they can either outlast it just because they have the resources to, or they find ways around it, once again, because they have the resources to. So is it going to affect them? Yeah. Is it going to affect them as much as it's going to affect you, me, and every other middle-class family in America? No.
Right. Let's talk about, this is a first of its kind under President Trump. He has frozen $2.2 billion in federal grants and federal funding from Harvard University because Harvard did not subject themselves to his restrictions and the things that he wanted colleges and universities to do, partly with DEI. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's unprecedented and uncalled for. These grants are already in place under a prior administration. Now, if he wants to, as a condition of his administration, say, if you want to apply for and get a grant from my administration, you got to do, A, B, C, and D. It's his administration. He has the right to do that. But what he's trying to do here is get higher education to bend to his will, and it's ironic that for 4 years they've been talking about how, higher education needs to be non-politicized. It needs to be free thought, and it needs to be where they're teaching the basics and not getting so political in higher education. And yet Donald Trump comes in and is basically saying higher education needs to bend to my political will. They're saying we want, input on what's being taught. No, that's the hallmarks of authoritarian state where, government is, in everything, and it has to be the will of who's currently governing. The hallmark of education, higher education, is free thought. It is to have a diversity of ideas. At no point do you see Donald Trump saying, I want to make sure you guys have a diversity of ideas. It's very much, I want you guys to subject yourself to what I want, what I think is politically okay, what I think is socially okay. That's not cool. That's just not cool. And yeah, it's Harvard. 99.99999% of us will not go to Harvard or have any straight connection with Harvard. But what Americans do see is a government that if it's Harvard next, if it's Harvard first, who's it going to be next? And the fact that this is so unprecedented, it hasn't been done, and it quite frankly is just un-American.
Do you think, or does President Trump have any legal justification for doing this? Or is it really just, as you stated, Harvard University will not bend to his will?
I think it's Harvard University not bending to his will. Like I mentioned earlier, if he wants to make, eliminating DEI, et cetera, condition to grants people are applying for and being awarded under his administration, knock yourself out. He won the presidency. He gets the ability to set those rules. But to go back retroactively and say, even though these were awarded 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, I'm going to come in and change the rules. That's not how these things work.
Right. Do you feel like, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, do you feel like HBCUs, much smaller, receive a much smaller pot of federal funding? Do you feel like they will bear this brunt more heavily than, say, your Harvards or any other Ivy League university?
Yes, because they don't, look, Harvard has the endowment, Harvard has the alumni, Harvard has the resources to withstand this assault on higher education. It's what it is. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. It's an assault on higher education that does not bend to Donald Trump's political will. You don't see him saying, I'm going to withhold $2.2 billion from Liberty University, from Regent University, from Bob Jones University. You don't see any of that. You see him saying it to schools that people look at and say, well, that's a liberal university. And HBCUs, they don't have those resources to really withstand this assault. And it really is going to be unfortunate if, they're next on the chopping block. If Trump goes to them and says, you got to get rid of, whatever I deem DEI program specific, or anything I just particularly don't like, your university got to get rid of it, or you're not going to get any federal funding. For someone who, courted the especially courted the male African-American vote, saying, I want to give you guys greater job opportunities. I want to give you guys upward mobility. For him to come in and say, I'm now going to cut from a group of colleges that cater mainly to African-Americans, that allow middle class and lower socioeconomic status African-Americans that upward mobility, it's once again a sign of this administration saying one thing, doing another.
How long do you think, and this is purely your opinion, how long do you think Harvard can push back against President Trump in saying, you're not going to get federal funding? The more you push back, the longer you do it, the more funding I'm taking.
If there's one university that can withstand it, it would be Harvard. And I could see them holding out for quite a while. Like I said, they have the endowment, they have the alumni base. They have the wherewithal to withstand it as long as they should. And I'm glad they are. I'm glad Harvard's standing up and saying no. So far everyone's been like, okay, we're going to change our DEI and whatnot. And I'm glad Harvard is finally standing up and saying, no, you don't get to be the bully on the block. We're not going to deal with it.
Now, former President Joe Biden is making an appearance. It'll be his first speaking appearance since the election of President Donald Trump. He is speaking in Chicago at a conference to help rally bipartisan support for Social Security. Are Democrats happy to see President Joe Biden show up again?
No, they're not. They're not. I was listening on audio tape to the book Fight this past past weekend, as I was traveling up and down the lovely state of Florida. And, really a lot of the predicament that the Democrats found themselves in last year, part of it is the party's own doing. And I've talked about it here, talked about it on several other networks, that the party was too busy thinking everything was roses when it wasn't, when it was not justifying voters' valid concerns. And part of that was because President Biden was so enamored with his legacy, enamored with keeping his legacy that it was just hear no evil, see no evil. And that goes to his fitness for office to run for reelection. When he first ran in 2020, he was going to be a bridge to the next generation. That's what he said, and
Yes.
And I think a lot of people took that to being like, okay, you're going to be a one-term president, and then it's going to be the next generation of leaders. It's going to be an open primary for Kamala Harris to run, for Gretchen Whitmer, for Governor Gavin Newsom, for Governor Josh Shapiro. The list goes on and on, to be able to run and be the next standard bearer of the party. And instead, what we found out is you had not only President Biden himself and his inner circle, but a lot of his staffers, a lot of his apparatus were like, you don't just give up 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And the ego got into play there a little bit, I think, instead of really sitting back and asking yourself, do I have the wherewithal to win another term against Donald Trump? Or do I need to step aside and give someone the opportunity, the on-ramp, the time to mount a much better challenge to Donald Trump than I can? And he didn't do that. The ego, the wanting of a legacy, I think, got in the way, and now we're stuck with a Republican-controlled House, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican and Donald Trump in the White House. And a lot of people point to President Biden as the reason why we're in this predicament. The fact that he held on so long, the fact that he was so stubborn and insistent, even though everyone, saw the signs that maybe he does need to step aside. And look, on one hand, it's easy to say he coulda, shoulda, woulda. On the other hand, look, it's hard to look yourself in the mirror and say, I can't do this, I'm going to step aside. Just as a human, it is hard to look in the mirror and say, I am going to think of the greater good instead of what is best for myself, what's best for my thinking, what's best for my legacy. So, but yeah, a lot of Democrats, point the finger at him, put the blame on him, and they're not excited to see him come out and say, well, I need to be a bigger part of the conversation. What they're saying is, you had an opportunity to be a part of the conversation a year or two ago when you could have stepped aside and said, we're going to have an open primary, and that didn't take place. So, and a lot of Democrats are also mad at the fact that he really didn't help Kamala all that much. I mean, there was an insistence, especially amongst Biden staffers, especially amongst his campaign apparatus, that, the Harris campaign just needed to be an extension of the Biden campaign. Biden campaign wasn't working. So, just having it as an extension with just a new face, that wasn't going to work. And we saw on election day that it didn't work.
Are you seeing the more conservative Democrats, such as AOC, Alexander Cortez, Bernie Sanders, setting a clear divide between them, their Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party of President Joe Biden?
I think they're setting a clear divide with their progressive brand of Democratic Party versus the more pragmatic brand of Democratic Party.
Okay.
And look, for AOC and Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders and all that, it's easy for them to sit there and be progressives. They are, in AOC's case, 1 vote out of 45 or 435. In Senator Sanders' case, 1 vote out of 100. They can have their brand of progressivism and not have to worry about results, really, not have to worry about making things happen. They can live in their little, ivory colored tower and say, this is the way things should be. And in a perfect world, this is how I would love for things to be. And there's a reason that the most successful Democratic governors, Democratic presidents in the past for the most part have been governors. Barack Obama was the exception, but Bill
Right.
Clinton, former governor. FDR was a former governor.
Yes.
The list goes. Jimmy Carter was a former governor. List goes on and on. Governors are by and large pragmatic. Governors are problem solvers. Their job is to run an entire state with very diverse viewpoints, very diverse interests. AOC comes from a House district that is very left-leaning, very progressive. Bernie Sanders comes from Vermont, which is the most progressive state by leaps and bounds of any state in the nation. I mean, Vermont makes California look conservative, for crying out loud. So it's easy for them to be in their bubbles and say this is what the Democratic Party should be. I look at governors like Gretchen Whitmer, like Josh Shapiro, like Andy Bashar out of Kentucky. Even my own governor here in California, you see, Governor Gavin Newsom, starting to move to the center on a variety of things. Governors are problem solvers, and that's, their job is to form a consensus to solve a problem that affects the entire state that they have to govern, while still maintaining to, very core democratic principles. And that's why they usually are the best candidates, especially when it comes to running for president.
Last question on this topic, Lee. Do you feel like the Democratic Party as a whole, there is clearly a divide in this party? Do you think this divide will eventually be the downfall of the Democratic Party?
No, look, all parties have divides. After a party loses the White House, all parties go out in the wilderness, but then there's some that brings them back together. You look at the Republicans after McCain lost and Bush's term ended. They were out in the wilderness for a couple of years, and then the Tea Party popped up in 2010, and even then there was still a divide. I mean, even with the Tea Party, there was a divide between the hardcore Tea Partiers and your more mainstream Republicans. And it really was Republican civil war for quite a while until Trump came in and coalesced everything under his brand of republicanism. So no, I don't think it's going to be the downfall of it. I think it's, it's always, you always have the best results when you have a clash of ideas and they go up against each other and the best ideas come out on top. The idea is that after a primary election, the candidate and the idea is that everyone can coalesce around and say, this is our person, this is our standard bearer. I think diversity of viewpoints is a good thing. I think it's a uniquely American thing. We celebrate it here. And I think, look, Republicans always love to call themselves a Big Ten party when in reality, especially now, not even close. It's MAGA or die with that party. Mm-hmm. I think the Democrats really need to take in that mantra of really being a Big Tent Democratic Party, to have a variety of viewpoints from your more conservative Democratic members to your more progressive Democratic members. But there are some core principles that we all can agree on, and I think those core principles we all need to agree on is making life better for the average everyday American. Lowering costs not just on groceries and gas, but lowering costs on healthcare, lowering costs on childcare, lowering costs on higher education, lowering costs on housing. We have a housing problem in especially in California. I was back in Florida, poking around, doing a little home shopping, and what I would pay for in Florida versus California. I mean, California prices 3-4 times higher than what I would pay for out there. So, really, there are some really core quality of life issues I think Democrats can all rally around and say, we need to make this better for the average American. That needs to be the tenet of our party.
Before I let you go, Lee, I have been hearing whispers, and maybe you have too, that your Governor Gavin Newsom, may be making a run bid for the presidency, while Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, may be making a bid for governorship of California. What are your thoughts on this?
Governor Newsom is a very Freudian slip on my part. Governor Newsom, very, very personable, very charismatic. I think, and you can see him start to position himself more to the center, when he's talking about, transgender athletes, transgender women playing in women's sports, and him calling it unfair. You see him taking these very cultural touch point issues and trying to come somewhat to the center. I wish he would have done that last year with Proposition 36, but it is what it is. I think what you see with former Vice President Harris is that people are starting to mention her running for governor. And I think what a lot of people were expecting was for the entire field to just clear, for people to just say, oh, she's thinking about it, I'm not even going to run. And, you saw that with Attorney General Rob Bonta, who everyone thought was going to run. And then he comes out and says, well, I'm not going to run because Kamala might run. But in the weeks and months since, you have seen a lot of people say, you know what, forget it. If she runs, I'm going to run anyway. Javier Becerra, former Secretary of Health and Human Services, threw his hat in the race to run. Antonio Villagrosa, former Speaker of the Assembly, former Mayor of LA, said, whether she gets in or not, I'm going to run. Tony Atkins, same thing. I'm running. So it's not going to be the cakewalk. I think the people in the Harris camp that were telling her, hey, you should run for governor. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be the cakewalk that I think they expected. And I think part of that goes to, there is this perception that she would just run for governor to position herself to run for president. And there would be a backlash against that there. And it's a salient point. It really is a salient point. I think if she were running for governor, she literally would have to come out and say, I'm not going to run for president. And if she can't say, I'm not going to run for president, I think voters would have a massive problem with that.
Do you think that's her end goal, to become governor of California so she can make a run again? This will be her third bid for president.
I don't know. Look, it's a lot. And to be perfectly honest, after the past 5 years that she's been through, if I were her and her husband, I'd probably want to say, find me a small Caribbean island. Let's go on vacation. Exactly. But I don't look, I'm not going to speculate as to whether that's her end goal. That's what a lot of people are speculating. I'm not going to speculate. I would like to think that the former Vice President Harris would on her face say, if I'm going to run for governor, it's because I want to serve 8 years as your governor. Yeah. I really want to affect change on the state level. Former Attorney General, she was able to do that as Attorney General, and it's something that she thinks she can have the most impact on statewide.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Lee, for coming on and breaking down some of these headlines that President Trump keeps making daily.
Always a pleasure to be on with you, Crystal. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. And to my listeners, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. Make sure you subscribe to my podcast so you can get the latest information on President Trump's headlines and how they are affecting you.